Before the Civil War, the federal government knew something it was never supposed to know. It knew your name, your address, and roughly how often you sent a letter to someone in another state, not because of a census, not because of a tax roll, because of the mail. The United States Post Office, between the 1830s and 1869, maintained a system of postmaster account books so precise, so geographically granular, that the handful of historians who have encountered surviving fragments describe them as the most accurate population record of the 19th century. More accurate than the decennial census, more detailed than church registers, more useful to economists than anything the federal government officially claimed to be tracking at the time. Then, in the window between 1869 and 1872, almost all of them vanished. What those records contained, why they disappeared, and who was better off for their absence, is a story that revisionist economic historians have been quietly assembling for decades. And the answer challenges something fundamental about the way we tell the story of American capitalism. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what the post office actually was before the age of railroads fully consumed it. Most people today think of the 19th century post office as a quaint relic, riders on horseback, handwritten letters sealed with wax, a slow, romantic institution that existed mostly for the literate and the wealthy. That image is almost entirely wrong. By 1840, the United States had more post offices than any country on earth, more than Britain, more than France, more than the entire German Confederation combined. There were over 13,000 post offices scattered across the country, from coastal commercial cities all the way to frontier settlements that did not yet appear on federal maps. The historian Richard John, in his landmark study of the early postal system, described it as the largest organizational endeavor the American state had ever attempted. At its peak before the Civil War, the post office employed more federal workers than the military, and because every postmaster was required to submit quarterly accounts to Washington, the federal government accumulated something extraordinary: a running quarter-by-quarter record of economic activity in nearly every inhabited community in the United States. These weren't just delivery logs. Postmasters recorded the volume of letters sent and received, the value of postage collected, the names of individuals holding uncollected mail, the names of individuals paying overdue postal fees, and in many districts the names attached to accounts operating on credit with the local postal agent. In rural areas especially, where banks were sparse and personal credit was hyper-local, the postmaster's records were often the only written document tracking the financial relationships inside a community. For a historian trying to reconstruct the economic landscape of pre-industrial America, these records are irreplaceable. They show who was trading with whom. They show which towns were commercially active and which were isolated. They show migration patterns through changes in mail forwarding. They show the rise and fall of small enterprises through changes in commercial correspondence volume. They show, in some surviving district records, the names of merchants who were corresponding with suppliers in 3 or 4 different states simultaneously, managing supply chains of real complexity entirely through personal correspondence, years before the first telegraph wire reached their county. They are, in a very real sense, the closest thing that existed to a living map of the American economy before the telegraph made communication instantaneous and before the railroad made geography collapse. So where did they go? The answer begins in 1869 when Ulysses Grant appointed John Creswell of Maryland as his new Postmaster General. Creswell was, by contemporary accounts, a serious reformer. He was genuinely interested in making the post office more efficient, more modern, and less corrupt. And the post office, at that moment, needed all three. The system had accumulated decades of bureaucratic dead weight. Regional postmasters operated with enormous autonomy. Accounting practices varied wildly from district to district. There was no uniform record-keeping standard, no centralized archive, and no systematic process for preserving historical accounts. Creswell launched what he called a comprehensive administrative reorganization. Old account books were to be reviewed, consolidated, and in cases where the records were deemed redundant or no longer operationally relevant, disposed of. The phrase used in the internal correspondence that survives from this period is telling, cleared from the active files. The reorganization was also tied to a physical reality that made wholesale destruction easy to justify. The Post Office Department in Washington had been operating in overcrowded facilities for years. Storage was a genuine problem. When Creswell's team moved operations into new quarters beginning in 1869, decisions about what travelled with the department and what stayed behind were made quickly by mid-level administrators without any systematic review of historical value. The records of the Dead Letter Office alone, which had accumulated for 3 decades, occupied more physical space than the entire personnel file of the United States Army. What exactly was cleared, and on whose authority, is where the historical record becomes genuinely murky. Researchers at the National Archives who have investigated this period report a gap in the postal record collections that is difficult to explain through ordinary administrative attrition. Routine documents from the 1870s onward survive in considerable volume. Routine documents from the 1840s and 1850s exist in scattered fragmentary form, but the decades between them, roughly 1836 to 1869, the period of most intensive economic expansion and geographic settlement in American history, are represented by a collection so thin that archivists have repeatedly flagged it as anomalous. It is not a clean gap. Some records survive, enough to confirm what the complete record would have contained, but not enough to reconstruct it. This is where the revisionist argument gets uncomfortable for the standard telling of American economic history. The standard telling goes roughly like this. The post-Civil War period was a time of creative economic destruction. Railroads unified the national market. Industrial capital consolidated production. Small local economies were absorbed into larger regional and national systems. Some people got rich, some got displaced. But the overall trajectory was growth, progress, modernization. The records that survived from this transition were almost entirely the records kept by the winners. The railroad companies, the large commercial banks, the industrial firms, the federal land agencies that administered the transfer of public land to private developers. These records form the documentary foundation for most of what we think we know about 19th century American economic life. What the postal records would have shown if they had survived intact is the economy that existed before that consolidation. And the fragments that do survive suggest it looked very different from the story the winners told. The economic historian David Henkin, whose research into 19th century postal culture produced one of the most thorough analyses of surviving postal fragments, found consistent evidence of a far more distributed commercial landscape than the standard narrative allows. Small-scale producers corresponding directly with buyers in distant cities, without intermediary merchants. Cooperative credit arrangements managed through chains of personal correspondence, outside the formal banking system. Local currencies, barter agreements and debt arrangements, whose existence we can only infer from postal records because no bank ever wrote them down. This was not a primitive economy waiting to be modernized. It was a functional, adaptive economic ecosystem built around direct correspondence and personal trust networks, and the railroad and banking consolidation of the Gilded Age did not simply improve upon it. In many respects, it dismantled it. The people who benefited most from that dismantling had very strong reasons to prefer that the earlier system leave as few records as possible. A comprehensive postal archive from the 1840s and 1850s would have made visible in painful statistical detail the scale of displacement that accompanied industrialization. It would have documented the commercial relationships that were severed, the local credit networks that collapsed, the small enterprises that were absorbed or destroyed. It would have created an evidentiary baseline against which the Gilded Age could have been measured and found wanting. This is not a claim that someone ordered the records burned. The historical evidence does not support that conclusion, and responsible revisionist historians are careful to say so. What the evidence does support is something more insidious, a culture of administrative indifference toward records that memorialized a pre-industrial economy operating inside an institution that was being actively reshaped to serve an industrial one. The people making decisions about what to preserve and what to clear from the active files were not neutral archivists. They were political appointees operating inside a federal government that was, in this exact period, making enormous grants to railroad companies, restructuring the national banking system, and overseeing one of the largest transfers of public land to private ownership in world history. They were not hostile to the old records exactly, they simply did not value them. And in a bureaucracy with limited storage, limited staff, and explicit instructions to modernize, things that are not valued get cleared. The result is a hole in the historical record that has shaped quietly and persistently every serious attempt to understand American economic development. When economists model 19th century growth, they work from the records that survived. When historians describe pre-industrial economic life, they work from the records that survived. When policymakers invoke the American past to argue for or against economic intervention, they are invoking a past documented almost entirely by the institutions that replaced the one that was lost. What fragments remain are revealing in proportion to their scarcity. A collection of postmaster account books from western Pennsylvania, covering portions of 1848 through 1855, was discovered in a county historical society in the 1970s. Researchers who analyzed them found correspondence volumes that implied commercial networks 3 to 4 times more active than standard economic histories of the region had assumed. Small iron producers, correspondence with buyers in Philadelphia and Baltimore, direct arrangements bypassing the major commercial agents whose records do survive. The network was dense, locally rooted, and apparently quite resilient, right up to the point where the railroad arrived and reorganized it out of existence. A separate collection from southern Ohio, covering 1841 through 1858, showed a pattern of seasonal commercial correspondence that tracked agricultural cycles with extraordinary precision, but also tracked something else. Letters to and from what appear to be cooperative purchasing arrangements, groups of small farmers pooling correspondence with distant suppliers to negotiate bulk pricing, the kind of economic behavior that, in the 20th century, we would call collective bargaining or cooperative procurement, operating quietly through the mail in the 1840s and leaving almost no trace except in these account books. The volume figures in that Ohio collection also suggest that the local postmaster was extending informal credit to regular correspondence, essentially acting as a microfinancial institution in a county where the nearest chartered bank was 40 miles away. This was not unusual behavior. It was, based on the surviving fragments, probably standard practice across hundreds of rural districts. But we can only confirm it in the places where the records accidentally survived. Both collections are extraordinary. Both are tiny, both survived essentially by accident, deposited in local archives by private individuals who had no particular reason to preserve them and no particular reason to destroy them. The systematic record is gone. What does it mean to lose the record of an economy? It means, in practical terms, that the economy you can document becomes, by default, the economy that is treated as normal. The railroad economy, the banking economy, the corporate economy, the one with the paper trail. The distributed economy that preceded it, the one built on correspondence networks and local credit and direct producer-to-buyer relationships, becomes, in the absence of its records, a kind of myth. Something historians can gesture toward but cannot fully reconstruct. Something that, in the political arguments of any given era, can be dismissed as romantic or speculative, because the documentation needed to defend it concretely simply is not there. This is the real cost of what happened between 1869 and 1872, not the loss of names and dates, the loss of an evidentiary foundation for an alternative account of how the American economy worked and what was sacrificed to build the one that replaced it. The post office knew every name. It knew every route, every volume, every seasonal rhythm of a commercial world that no longer exists, and that left almost no record of its own passing. And then the records disappeared. Not with drama, not with conspiracy, just with the ordinary bureaucratic indifference of an institution that had already decided what it was building next and had no particular use for what it was leaving behind. The question worth sitting with is a simple one. If those records had survived intact, systematically preserved the way that railroad company ledgers were preserved, or the way that bank records were preserved, or the way that federal land grant documents were preserved, what would our understanding of American capitalism look like today? What economic arrangements that we treat as inevitable would turn out to have been choices? What alternatives that we treat as naively pre-modern would turn out to have been, on their own terms, sophisticated and functional and deliberately displaced? We cannot answer those questions with the record we have. That is precisely and uncomfortably the point. The post office knew every name. That knowledge is gone. And the history we tell in its absence is, whether we acknowledge it or not, a history shaped by that absence. If this kind of buried economic history is something you want to keep pulling on, the next video looks at another set of vanished records that economists still argue about today. Same era, different institution, and an erasure that, unlike this one, actually did leave behind a paper trail of who ordered it. That one is on screen now.